Yeah.
Oh, hey, you did. We are live.
We are live
Yes.
calling Chris Anderson in New Orleans
Yes, I'm still in New Orleans, and Colonies Baer, it looks like back in Chicago.
and Chicago. And not only you're in New Orleans, you're in ground zero
I
of
am
Stephen Ambrose historical tours.
the belly of the beast, as they say.
There it is, ladies and gentlemen. That is the place where it all happens from, or at least that's the hallway
That's the hallway where
in the
it
place
found
where
us.
it all happens from.
Yes.
Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. We do tours in Europe, U.S., and Pacific. You can check it out at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live or on replay or listening on the
Ooh,
History
I
Happy Hour
know.
podcast, thank you for joining us. And today our topic is going to be Hessians in the American Revolution and a wonderful new book on this topic. Chris, I just, we just got together. We were
I
just in New
know.
Orleans together.
Yes.
And you were so well dressed
Thank you.
that I felt I had to up my game
You were
today.
inspired, so you added a bow tie.
I did. Not only that, but this is my new shirt from Cordings in London.
Oh, you got another one. Did you
I
buy two?
I did. I bought two new ones
Wow.
and then I'm wearing in honor of you, I'm wearing my Fletcher tartan here because I am a Fletcher,
See,
and
I'm glad
so
I'm rubbing off on you finally.
I'm just trying to up the game as much as I can.
Appreciate that. Appreciate that.
I do have a little bad news to start out with today, which is that we lost a Ghost Army veteran this morning, one of the 10 surviving Ghost Army veterans. And just to mention that, Manny Frocht, who I was with in August, died today at age 98. He served in the 3132nd Signal Company, the sonic unit of the Ghost Army. During the Battle of the Bulge, he suffered severe frostbite in his feet, so he had to be evacuated. And then was eventually did not come back to the unit. Was recovering for the rest of the war, but we got to honor him, for being awarded the Congressional Gold Medal along with the other soldiers in the Ghost Army in August. And so a toast. I know I'm the only one with a cocktail today,
But I'm
but
thinking about
but a
cocktails.
toast to Manny and his fellow soldiers and to everybody who served in that war. Do we have anybody watching us
We
today,
do,
Chris?
believe it. Yeah, Lydia's come back. So, hello, Lydia. Good to hear or
Hey,
see you
Lydia.
again. Lynn Hargrove, Lizzie Borden again from back home in London. Lorelei Ken, Scott Grimwood, and yeah,
Well, guys, let us know what cocktails you're drinking. I'm actually having a German beer in a mug from the Berghoff in honor of our topic today. Chris, we have delayed enough time. Our
I
guest is
think so.
wondering when we're going to get to her. So
Yeah.
why don't you give me a cue to get going here?
The bar is open.
The bar is open, and Chris, what's on tap?
Yeah. Well, I'm really excited about this book about the Hessians. We're being joined by Friederike Baer, and she is the Associate Professor of History in the division head for Arts and Humanities at Pennsylvania State University. Her research focuses on the experiences of German-speaking people in North America, and her publications include The Trial of Friedrich Eberl, Language, Patriotism, and Citizenship in Philadelphia's German Community from 1790 and 1830. But more importantly, she has just come out with this great new book, Hessians, German Soldiers in the American Revolutionary War. So, Frederica, thank you for joining us.
Hi, so happy to be here.
Good, thank you. So, Frederica, I'm gonna get kind of right in because I know we're a bit pressed, but back in July 1776, there's a group of men, and they've gotten together, and they're just whining a lot about things that they're complaining about all sorts of things.
We're right away. We're getting
Right,
after
right
this.
into
Okay.
it. But as they're drafting what becomes the Declaration of Independence, they have a list of grievances about why King George is no longer fit to be king. And he says, amongst other things, that he is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely parallel in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. So that tends to be the impression that's been passed down of Hessians. What little people know is that they're just evil mercenaries sent to wreak destruction. How much? Where does this kind of false narrative come from? I know at the time, how does it sustain itself for so long? Because obviously in this book, you paint a much different picture.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that as the line from the Declaration of Independence indicates, the patriots were essentially using the king's decision to hire foreigners, specifically Germans, in the war against his own subjects, as a tool, really, to support independence and ultimately to encourage colonists to resist against this oppression. Right. And so the patriots very intentionally, actively painted a picture of these German soldiers as mercenaries, as cruel, as being hired by the king really to do his dirty work. And they started doing that before the first German soldiers set foot on American soil. So it was part of, I would say, their propaganda, really, before the first Germans even arrived. And then it continues. This narrative continues, especially through the fall of 76. Mm-hmm. It gets changed somewhat after Trenton, but it's really remained with us. I mean, the reference to the Germans as mercenary, it's not the correct label, is very telling. Mercenaries, this idea that individuals kind of going to war for foreign power out of greed for personal gain. Yeah. So it really doesn't describe them accurately, but that's the image that's been with us since 76.
Yeah.
So about 30,000 soldiers from Germany under their own officers and commanders are fighting with the British Army in North America. Mm-hmm. Who are they? And why did the British choose to rely so strongly on these, I'll use a phrase that you used, these rental armies for this war?
Yeah, so it becomes very clear early on, already in 75, basically, that the British do not have enough soldiers in North America to put down the rebellion. It also is pretty clear early on that the British will not be able to raise a sufficient number of troops in England or other parts of the empire. So they're doing what they've done for about a century already, namely turn to foreign rulers to hire soldiers. So this is nothing new. This is something that Britain had done before. And the German territories, for the most part, that enter into these agreements had already done this in the past as well. So the practice was generally accepted throughout Europe. They go to, in the fall of 76, the king sends an emissary to various German courts. We should, of course, I guess, remind everyone that Germany does not exist as a nation. The Holy Roman Empire is divided into hundreds of small territories, mostly German-speaking, and the 6 territories that ultimately decide to hire out soldiers are part of the Holy Roman Empire. A couple of these rulers had already offered troops. That as soon as they knew there's a war going on, they're going to be asking, they already offered troops. So the emissary's name is William Fawcett. He goes first to Braunschweig, then to Kassel and other territories, and negotiates for soldiers. And ultimately, as I mentioned, it's 6 territories. Hessen-Kassel rented out approximately 20,000 troops. Hessen-Hanau, at the time ruled by the hereditary Prince of Hessen, rented out perhaps 2,500. The others come from Braunschweig, Wolfenbüttel, Anhalt-Zerbst, Waldeck, and Ansbach-Bayreuth. So the numbers vary widely. 1,200 total or so from Waldeck to 20,000 plus from Hessen-Kassel. And because so many came from Hessen, they're collectively known as Hessians, although they're really coming from all kinds of different places throughout the Holy Roman Empire. So it is really the king needs soldiers, and this seemed to be a convenient way to get trained, outfitted men across the Atlantic quickly in time for a first campaign in the summer of 76.
So Friederike, one of the things that I found really interesting in the book that I'd like you to kind of expand on is your definition, or I shouldn't say your definition, the definition at the time of what a mercenary was. right? I mean, because you make the very interesting point that there are a lot more mercenaries involved in the war than people think.
Yeah, what's important to keep in mind about these auxiliary troops, that's really what they're called. That would be a better name for them. They're hired out by their rulers. As you already mentioned, these essentially the king enters into an agreement with, say, the Duke of Braunschweig and says, I want 5,000 infantry or whatever it was, so many regiments, equipment, and all of that. And then the ruler is responsible for raising these troops and renting them out as units with, as you already suggested, their own commanders and so forth. So that's very different from an individual soldier kind of signing up on his own to serve in the British Army, for example. There were some of them, and some of you may, I mentioned this, I think, briefly in the book, the so-called Scheiter recruits.
Yeah.
There were military contractors out there that tried to, for personal gain, literally raise troops. They got money, the kind of a commission for it, and there were maybe up to 2,000 literally mercenaries that were raised in Germany, and they were distributed across British infantry regiments. These are not considered Hessians. So the ones I'm talking about are these sort of complete units that are hired out by their respective German rulers. One thing about the term mercenary, I think, is also interesting, because when you read newspaper accounts from the time period, including British criticism of the war, as you know, there are some people in Britain who are against the war in America.
Why?
Yes, there are intelligent people everywhere.
And so when you read their accounts, they're referring to soldiers that fight in America generally, often as mercenary. It's kind of a slur. It's like, these people are not fighting kind of a noble war for a just cause. They're fighting to oppress others. So the term is used for propaganda purposes in different ways throughout this conflict.
But yeah, one of the great things that's interesting about the revolution is I mean, there's a whole book to be had, probably has been written, probably several, about sort of the uses of propaganda by both sides, the constant propaganda war that's going on. But I wanted to pick up, and eventually we'll get to what happens when the Hessians and non-Hessians get to these shores. But I wanted to pick up on one thing you mentioned, which is that it was also the use of these soldiers in America. Obviously, the Americans, as Chris pointed out from reading from the Declaration of Independence, made a big deal out of it. But there were people in Britain as well who sort of thought, were kind of shocked that the British government is hiring, foreigners to come and battle its own subjects.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. The opposition in Britain, which again is quite sizable, really seizes on this and attacks in Parliament and in the press as well. The King and Lord North and anyone who's in favor of this as being completely wrong-headed for a number of reasons. It's really expensive. I mean, that's of course important to keep in mind. The British rulers, what they're getting is subsidy payments and huge amounts of money. So the
German rulers are getting.
Yes, they're getting huge amount of money. So the opposition is concerned about that. The other criticism is about the loyalty of these Germans. Some people question that. Will they be loyal once they're in America? Will they really be fighting for the British? Considering especially that so many Germans had already settled in British North America, and approximately 80,000 or so by the time of the American Revolution. What would happen if these soldiers went to America and saw how happy their countrymen lived, and maybe they would just desert immediately and settle and bomb the land? And then there's also skepticism. It's embarrassing, basically. The opposition argues things like, how the mighty British king, begging these petty, small tyrants, these rulers, they're all absolutist little rulers, and, for help. I mean, how embarrassing is that Britain cannot take care of its colonies itself, that it is relying on the help of these decidedly to use a modern word, undemocratic states, when Britain really saw itself already as much more enlightened in terms of liberties and so forth. So what would happen? We're introducing all these people into our empire. Lots of criticism from it's expensive to these people are disloyal to are they perhaps going to hurt us more than help us once they're in America.
So, Frederica, something else I found very interesting. I had always assumed that the princes are just taking regiments that already existed and they're sending them, but that's not the case. They're actually recruiting a lot of these units from scratch. So, could you tell us a little bit about, how that process works and who's joining to go fight in America? Why are they doing this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's always of that assumption that these princes just sort of have those troops ready to go, and you just put them on transports and send them to America. And that was definitely not the case. Now, they all, of course, had veterans, and they had soldiers, and they wanted to have experienced soldiers in all of these regiments. And of the officer corps or two, of course, you want experienced leaders to fill these kind of positions. But to really fill the regiments, they all had to rely on raising fresh recruits. We don't have drafts the way we have in a modern sense. Very generally speaking, these territories used kind of conscription lists. So, different regions, regional officials had lists of young men that were eligible in terms of age, perhaps, and physical fitness that could potentially be recruited. So these officials were asked to fill regiments based on these kind of records. Many men were recalled from furlough, men that were on garrison duty, essentially, that were in the military, but basically had gotten used to spending maybe 4 weeks out of the year in some kind of training, but the rest of the time were at home on the farm or whatever. Many of these men were recalled. And then all of these rulers had to go recruiting. And what they generally did is, which I think makes total sense, is you want to recruit men that were considered expendable. So in other words, very, very simply put, a man whose presence in the territory was not essential for the economy, for example, or whatever, is, of course, more likely to be sent to America than someone who works in an essential industry, or maybe a university student, or someone who has, takes care of a large family. So there are certain men that are kind of targeted with, okay, we can live without you, but we'd rather keep you at home. Right. So ideally, you only send expendable men. In reality, that did not work. There aren't enough men. It's also not always clear by who's, someone who's expendable to the Landgraf may not be expendable to the local, by the local community. So you have a mix of people that get sent abroad, including men that really should have stayed home because of their responsibilities. I should also mention that in all of these territories, some people wanted men to be sent abroad. For example, which I thought was really interesting, I found quite a few petitions from women who are basically saying, hey, my husband has a drinking problem, for example. He's drinking up the family income, or he's fed to my daughters from my first marriage. Or sometimes it's in-laws who saying, our son-in-law, he's basically no good, send him to America. So in some cases, that's what happened. In other cases, neighbors, for example, there's one case, for example, where in-laws saying, send this guy to America, he's no good. Neighbors then say, no, wait, hey, he's the only wig maker in town.
You gotta have a wig maker.
Oh my God.
So things like that. There's also, and I think this is true probably for every war, of course, there are young men who are looking for opportunities. They're looking to advance their military careers. They don't have a lot of options at home. So for them, joining the military, going to America is an opportunity. We have some people who are essentially explorers. And they're like, I can explore North America. I've always wanted to travel, and this is a way for me to do that. We have poets who have very romantic sort of ideas of warfare and the quote unquote new world who's signing up as well. So it's a real mix of people. But to go back to the beginning, to your question, many of these men probably had never had a gun in their hands or rifle. And that, I think that's important to keep in mind. This is not a professional army that is going to North America.
Well, one of the great things about your book is that you have mined a lot of sources in Germany that clearly other historians, perhaps because of language, have not mined and not looked at. So your book's not just about the Hessians, the German soldiers, and what they did in America. It's sort of what their point of view is, what it's like for them, what their feelings are, what are the thoughts that they put down, etc. And here they are. They're crossing the ocean to, as you said, they're exploring, join the Navy, see the world. Oh, not quite the same, but close. They're coming to North America, and it's really a strange place to them. And I'm interested in kind of what their reactions are to this, and I'll start you with a quote from your book. You said that most Hessians could not fathom why such a prosperous people would take up arms against a benevolent king.
Indeed.
This is for you, Chris, under whose watch they had done so well. So tell us a little bit about the reactions of the soldiers that you've been able to discover upon coming to America, to the country, to the politics, to the conflict, the whole thing.
Yes. I think the quote really captures their impressions very well. When they come to North America, and I should mention, many knew very little about North America, so it really was like a new world truly to them. And I think one surgeon at some point, when his vessel approaches the coast of Canada, he says, "We felt like Columbus," as we were sailing sort of towards the New World. So. When they arrive, and I'm going to focus on the ones that arrive in the New York region, the first major Hessian contingents, their impressions were uniformly positive. They were really amazed by the richness of the land, the farmland, the orchards, the abundance of fruit trees and all the stuff you could grow there. They say things like, the humblest house of a white inhabitant on Staten Island, for example, is nicer as the big house of the richest Hessian in my village. So the standard of living strikes them as really impressive compared to where they're coming from. So they're looking at all of this, and they're of course, they're confused. Like, why would a people rise up against a ruler under whose rule they had done so well? It is generally confusing to them. I should mention that at the outset of the war, and I don't think that really changes a lot over the course of the war, the majority of these troops don't have a good understanding of what the revolution is about. They don't really talk much in their correspondence about politics or the reasons for the rebellion. What they do believe, though, is that, again, given that these people seem to be living so well, they have all these liberties that, what else would you want? What they are beginning to assume early on is that the revolutionary leaders that they can identify by name, people like John Hancock, for example, are selfish committeemen, as one Hessian calls them, who are manipulating the people for their own private gain. So, in other words, this idea that we hear often is like sort of the citizen soldier, the American, taking up arms in defense of liberty. From the Hessian perspective, that makes no sense. They have all the liberty already. So, but they're fighting really because they're being deluded by a handful of politicians. one thing that over the course of the war reinforces this idea is the destruction that they see. And I think that's important to keep in mind as well. One of the first examples of destruction that the Germans witness, and they blame the American fanatics for it, is the Great Fire of New York. Shortly after their arrival, I think it was September 76, when half of New York, well, not half, but quarter, whatever, of New York's burned to the ground. The Hessians suspect that this fire was deliberately set by American rebels, as they call them, throughout the war. And to them, that is evidence that these are deluded fanatics who are willing to destroy their own towns, habitations, farms, for the sake of, winning this war. So they're not essentially rational people, is what they assume.
The other thing that I found, well,
No comment on that. Come on, no,
no,
nothing. You're really walking the line there. You're being very careful.
I am.
I know how hard this is for you.
Well, the other thing that I again, so many interesting little insights, but the other thing that I found fascinating was one of the things that shocks them is slavery and the treatment of blacks, and that remains pretty consistent throughout their stay in North America. So could you talk a little bit about, their reaction to slavery and what they do with it, and does it change? Was it,
Yeah, no, that's absolutely. It does not change. They're extremely critical of slavery, the way they see it or encounter it in North America, and they encounter it right away in New York. So that's another thing that's important to keep in mind. It's not that they don't see enslaved people until they go south. They see it everywhere in North America. And in fact, when they talk about Staten Island and New York and New Jersey, they do. Many of them say, "Oh, when we talk about the prosperity of the people, we're talking about the prosperity of the white people." And one reason why they're doing so well is because they are able to essentially take advantage of the labor of Black people. They are doing all the hard work. Many of these observers comment on that repeatedly. It's important, I think, to keep in mind that they, as far as I can tell, they don't really understand slavery as a legal institution. I don't think they have much of an understanding of what it means to be an enslaved person in North America. What they do know, however, is the idea of the fact that there are maybe servants and their masters. And serfdom still exists in Hessian at the time. So they're very familiar with the fact that some people are serving others. That is not really the problem for them. The problem for them is how Black men, women, and children are treated by whites. And so they comment extensively about this throughout the war, that they feel that Black individuals are treated worse than a Hessian farmer would treat his cattle, for example. They're poorly clothed, they're treated violently. There is one story, Andreas Wiederhold, who is a Hessian in captivity at some point, he tells a story about a slave who was, the story that an enslaved man killed the children of his master. And Andreas Wiederhold essentially says, it was a normal reaction. Any human would react the way this enslaved man had, because the master had previously killed a child of that enslaved man. So it's an extremely brutal system. It's an exploitative system, and they see it across the colonies.
So if there's one battle involving Hessians that Americans probably know about, it's the Battle of Trenton that you mentioned in 1776, because George Washington crosses the Delaware, very famous, launches a surprise attack on Hessians under Colonel Rahl in Trenton, and defeats them, I think, on December 26th, 1776. And you have a quote in your book from London Magazine. You said, "This small success," this is from London Magazine from the time, "this small success wonderfully raised the spirits of the Americans. The Hessians had hitherto been very terrible to the Americans. The charm was now, however, resolved, and the Hessians were no longer terrible. So how would you characterize the impact that this battle has on the War of Independence, on the Americans, and on the Germans themselves?
Yeah, I think it definitely was a major morale boosting event at a time when that was sorely needed. The campaign of '76 had gone quite well for the British, and they went, I think, into winter quarters, including the Hessians, with a lot of confidence that things are going quite well. There are quite a few Germans who say, we're probably going to be going home next year. This will be over in no time. And so
just some
when
mopping up to do.
Yeah, exactly. So then when this surprise attack, although it wasn't a total surprise, I think I write about it a little bit in my book. I mean, I think it was surprising what George Washington ultimately decided to do, but there were some in the days leading up to it. There were
warning
some
signs.
Yeah, there was clearly warning signs something is going to happen. So I think this attack, which ended in the capture with more than 1,000 Hessians at Trenton, and then of course the Americans follow up with the victories at Princeton, I think was a morale boosting event, as I mentioned, for the Americans, much needed. So for Washington, also Washington himself being there was in a really important battle in that regard. For the Hessians, of course, it was really pretty embarrassing. It was a humiliating and very disappointing development. However, I do want to mention that when you read about how they talk about Trenton, this unfortunate affair, as Hessians often refer to it, it was conveniently the commander had been killed, Johann Rall. So they blamed him for being an inept leader in this particular situation. I should mention that Rall was otherwise, I think, had a very good reputation. He was well liked by his men. He was involved in the capture of Fort Washington, so he had actually a pretty good record. But he turned out to be not equipped to deal with the American attack at Trenton. So the fact that he was mortally wounded allowed many of the officers who later testified. There was a court-martial.
It's not our fault. It was him. It was him.
Yes, and then of course it was him, and then of course it was also the weather. There was a snowstorm, and our cannon didn't, fire, and that kind of thing. So it was humiliating. But I think it does change the American view of the Hessians in the sense that. Yes, they're no longer these horrible, cruel, monstrous mercenaries, but they're in fact kind of pitiful almost. We need to feel sorry for them. And almost immediately, when these Trenton prisoners get marched through Philadelphia, Washington instructs people to welcome them and to treat them well, because after all, they too are the innocent victims of tyrannical rulers. So the perspective shifts to some extent. The Hessians are, I think, from the Hessian perspective, the battle that has a much more serious impact on their confidence is Red Bank, which is in the fall of 1777. Trenton, you can almost write off, it's a snowstorm. In winter quarters. Christmas.
Yeah, certainly.
Come on.
Right.
Overwhelming American. There are all these. You can rationalize it almost, but then fast forward to October '77, and you have Red Bank, where an almost exclusively German force attacks this relatively small stronghold in New Jersey, which ends in total disaster. That's a much more devastating experience in terms of their confidence. And then on top of that, October '77 coincides with Saratoga. And then the French will soon enter the war. So I think, from my perspective, Red Bank is one of the underrated, underappreciated battles that involves the Hessians. But of course, Trenton is important. Washington is there, and it does bolster American morale for sure.
So, Frederica, I think I had no idea really until I read the book, and most Americans don't, but the Hessian participation is massive. I mean, I'm picking up on what we saw. We always think about Trenton. You mentioned Red Bank, but there are 30,000 Hessians deployed, and it's safe to say from 1776 till the end of the war, just about every engagement, there are Hessians present. How important is this contingent to Britain's ability to wage war and to their war effort?
It's been estimated that approximately a third of the British regular army strength was German, by 1780, 81. So I think there's historian Stephen Conway who's written a lot about this. And I think that alone is substantial. I think it allowed Britain to fight this war for as long as they did. I think they gave the presence, the participation of these troops gave Britain a chance to actually potentially win this.
Mm-hmm. One thing that Chris, just listening to your question and responding it also reduces the casualty rolls that come back to London and Greenwich and Birmingham and wherever in England. So you can in a way it allows I suppose it allows the government to kind of continue going along, whereas if you had 1/3 more casualties, it would be that much harder to convince your citizens to keep going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what was the impression of? We know obviously that the Americans were a little disdainful, shall we say, of the Hessians when they arrived. What was the impression of their British comrades in arms to this German force? Were they favorable? Did they work well together? Was it adversarial?
That's a really good question. I didn't go that much into British records, soldiers commenting on the presence of Germans in, their fight. They're always often fight side by side. There is some evidence, at least on the German parts, that there's some tension, some resentment, especially amongst German officers, because although the German units were commanded by German officers and they have German generals and all that, the highest ranking officer was always a British, with one or two exceptions. And then when they had to serve together, there's the language barrier. I think that's probably the biggest issue that really bothers some of these officers, who will be very, very frustrated with the inability to understand British commands. They feel like often when the men are exercised together, it's using British commands and British drum rolls or whatever, and so the Germans are often frustrated with the inability to understand what's being said, and that in turn they feel hinders their chances of advancement and so forth. So there's I think there's more tension between the Hessians and loyalists who are recruited in America, partly because they're always very suspicious of their loyalty. Yeah. I think that's more of a concern for them, fighting alongside loyalists and also fighting alongside Native Americans, which is another community that they're ambivalent about.
Yeah. We have a lot of questions from the audience that revolve around the same point, which is at the end of the war, how many of the Hessians, the German soldiers, end up staying in America after the war? Were they invited to stay? Did many of them want to stay? Is it a very small percentage? I've got 3 or 4 different variations on this question. And so maybe you could, I know you touch on that in the book, maybe you could touch on that now.
So I can give you some quick numbers. So we are estimating again that maybe 30,000 or so soldiers, probably actually more, but let's say 30,000 served in America over the course of the war. Around 7,500 or so died during the war in America, 1,200 of those in battle. So as was always the case, in the 18th century wars, the greatest killer is disease. Most of them die of disease. So 23,000 or so survived. Of those, we estimate that maybe 5,000 or 6,000 decided to stayed in North America. Either they left already during the war or in 1783 when the Corps was getting ready to evacuate. At least half of them actually went to Canada. So Britain offered land grants to soldiers who decided to settle in provinces like Nova Scotia and Quebec and other places. And a couple of thousand Germans took them up on this offer. Keep in mind that several thousand Germans spent the entire war in Canada. Also something we tend to forget. Not all German soldiers went with Burgoyne in 76 to Saratoga and were captured. A couple of thousand stayed behind, and they were replenished with new troops for the remainder of the war. So some of these, in other words, had lived there already for a while, and they just decided to stay. But then there may be 2,500 or so that stayed in what then became the United States. During the war, the Americans offered land and liberty, and usually also a couple of farm animals to any German soldier who deserted. And there's certainly some who took them up on that offer. Not as many as the Americans, I think, would have hoped. But then when the war is over, especially after Yorktown, when things are winding down, and when we still have several thousand German troops in captivity, they're prisoners of war. When they are learning that the war is coming to an end and they're getting ready to be sent back to Germany, some of them decide just not to report back to New York or wherever they're asked to report back to. They're officially considered deserters, but it doesn't look like the officials or the officers made a lot of, tried very hard to retrieve them. One thing I just want to mention here, not all of them, but several of these subsidy treaties included clauses that prohibited soldiers to remain in America without permission.
The treaties that the German principalities signed with England to supply the soldiers to them.
Yes, because there was some concern that, hey, some of these Germans might think, hey, free passage to America. Right. So they were actually, and also all of the German rulers are very concerned about depopulating, especially the countryside, and sending too many young men abroad. So we basically want them back. Not everyone who wanted to stay in America got to stay in America. I think that's important to keep in mind. At the same time, not everyone who wanted to return to Germany got to return to Germany, because especially men who had been injured perhaps, or who had been gotten into trouble, had some sort of infraction during military service, in some cases were to be denied return passes to Germany because they were considered to be essentially burdens once they returned. So we have some people who probably stayed here who would have preferred to go back. But yeah, 2,500 to 3,000 or so. From all my book, that would have been probably volume 2 to figure out what happened to them. Right. But from what we can tell, I think they were welcomed they're settled in predominantly German American communities, Maryland, Pennsylvania, places like that. Again, some had been prisoners of war in some of these places. They married American women. From what I can tell, they were not treated with any kind of hostility when they decided to stay behind.
Yeah, we're gonna give Chris Anderson one more question, and then we're just gonna kick him off the show. We should tell people before they think that he's left in a huff that he's trying to catch an airplane because for whatever reason he doesn't want to stay in New Orleans. He wants to go back to his home in London under the tutelage of the king and His
most beneficent Majesty Charles.
And
yes.
Be eating his fish and chips and doing all that English stuff that they do in England. And so, Chris, ask your question, and then I don't know if I've never tried to handle this show by myself.
You're in good hands.
I am petrified, but you know what? We're gonna let you ask your question and then let you go.
So, Frederica, one of the things, again, because all these little insights that are just really compelling in the book, but given what we talked about earlier, that I didn't know this, but these units were largely recruited for the war. So, in a way, you could say that they're kind of a it's not a citizen army, but they're not professional in the sense that they are used to being sent away. Right. So if you take 30,000 young men out of what are arguably pretty small communities in Germany and send them away, what is the impact of this movement of people on these communities? Are they following the war? Or do they suffer? Do they gain economically? What's happening back home?
Yeah. So there's the different ways to answer this. One very general consequence of all of this is that German-speaking Europeans are learning a lot more about North America than ever before. So that's one immediate response, essentially. Suddenly, all these Germans are going to North America. Suddenly, periodicals are beginning to report about what's happening. Soldiers are also writing letters and accounts for public consumptions. In other words, they're sent back home during the war to be published, sometimes in serialized form. So people learning more about North America. So that's one immediate consequence. Now, the communities themselves, many of them really are hit hard by the departure of so many men, or essentially, in many cases, breadwinners. And I've come across thick files of letters, petitions, reports from individuals, family members, but also local officials who are basically saying, here is this woman with her 3 children, the man was sent abroad, and here is the father who had relied on his only son to run the mill or whatever. Here is this mother who can no longer, keep up the shop. So there is definitely a real economic hardship for many of these families. The rulers tried to help by offering things like firewood, for example, or relieving them of some of the what we call tax burdens. But there's definitely economic hardship. At the same time, the recruitment of all these troops, they all needed stuff. They need uniforms. They need an incredible amount of things that needed to be manufactured and sold and transported. So there are also a lot of people throughout the empire who are benefiting from all of this, because it's more, as you know, good business for some people. So there is that side to it as well. Absolutely. Yeah.
Frederick, buy the book, everybody. It's wonderful. Thank you so much. Good luck.
Thank you.
Goodbye, Chris. Everybody else, please stay.
Yeah, please stay.
I'll stay.
Good.
Well, I'm glad that you'll stay, because if I'm talking all by myself, it's going to be terribly problematic, and we don't really want to have that happen. There's so much to ask you about, and we have more questions coming in, but I would like to ask you to tell us a little bit about one of my favorite characters of the American Revolution, someone you share a name with, Baroness Riedesel, Friederike Riedesel. She is married to a German officer. She makes this amazing journey to the United States. She's determined to get to the United States, to be, which isn't the United States yet. Of course, she's not, Germany isn't Germany yet, and the United States isn't the United States yet, but to be with her husband. And so she ends up being, he is the commander of the Braunschweiger Jäger. So she ends up being at the Battle of Saratoga because her husband is serving under General Burgoyne, and she leaves an amazing diary. So tell us a little bit about her.
Yeah, so she is this woman who, when her husband Adolf gets the call to go, he's actually the commander of all the entire Braunschweig Corps. For him, this is an incredible career opportunity. The war, like for many officers, like there's war, so we can advance our careers. And so he goes to North America, and she, back in Wolfenbüttel, immediately decides to go follow him. She can't, for various reasons, go literally with him. There's a delay. To make a long story short, she does eventually catch up with him in Canada. She has 3 young daughters at the time. She was pregnant when he left. That's one reason why
she was having a baby, so she couldn't make a transatlantic journey.
Yeah, so she has these 3 very young, like 1, 3, and 4, something like that. And she arrives in Canada and follows her husband to Saratoga, and she witnesses essentially the battles She sees in the house where she's staying with some other wives of other officers and children. Throughout the battle, they bring in injured officers, including one who essentially dies on her dining room table. So it's a very moving description of really also the violence of this war. And then she ends up being going into captivity with the so-called Convention Army. She spent some time in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then the Convention Army, as some of you will know, is moved to Virginia, where she's in Charlottesville. And she befriends Jefferson and other prominent Americans. She meets the Marquis de Lafayette at some point. So she is a very interesting woman who is really, quite honestly, enjoying an opportunity for her, for this opportunity to see a world that is very different from hers, as a sort of an upper class German housewife mother, and probably had limited opportunities to get out and do things like that. So she takes full advantage and she spends the entire war in North America, writes about eating bear meat, for example, and describes Native Americans that she's seeking out. She wants to meet Native Americans and talks about that. She has two more daughters in North America. One is called America and the other one is called Canada. Canada dies in infancy. America survives to adulthood. When they're back in Europe, she has two more children. One is called George, and one is called Charlotte, after the British
king and queen. Yeah.
So she definitely is very moved by what she sees. She considered it her tour of duty. Berufsreise is the German word for it. And her account has been translated into English. It's a very good translation, so I recommend it if you get your hands on it. It's very unique. It's the only known account by a woman who accompanied the German Corps to North America.
Well, as you know, both Chris and I lead tours for Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, and I do Revolutionary War tours, and one of them is the Boston to Quebec Revolutionary War Tour. We'll do another ad for it. It's coming up in next summer, at the end of next summer. And when we're in Saratoga, we go to the house, the Marshall House, now known, where she was staying, where the British officer was killed on her dining room table while he was being operated on. Another cannonball came in and hit him. And we go down. It's a private home, but the owner takes us down into the basement where she was, huddled with her children to hide from the cannonade. And they read excerpts from her diary and her journal, and she's pretty amazing. Do you know what the title of her account is? We have somebody asking about that. Like the book, is it? Riedesel is spell Riedesel. That'll help everybody.
Riedesel.
Baroness Friederike Riedesel. So you should be able to find it, guys.
You'll find it.
And there's bunches of it online too. I've been able to find large amounts of it online as well.
She's quite well known, and she years after they returned to Germany, they corresponded with Jefferson. Philip Schuyler took him in after. Said it's really an interesting story connected to many different Americans and also French officers.
I want to bring up a question that Skip Cornett put a question up here. There were obviously Germans in America, as you mentioned, about 80,000 of them. What kind of relations did they have with the Hessian soldiers, the Germans who came in the war?
Yeah, great question. So the German soldiers that spent time in places like Northern Maryland and also Pennsylvania generally described it as in very favorable terms. They liked the fact that it was quite German. They liked the fact that they could eat German food and the farms looked German to them. And in Germantown, Pennsylvania, there was actually a German language newspaper at the time, which they used. The German Americans weren't quite as excited to see them. They were for obvious reasons, very ambivalent, and I write about it in my book. The German American, the German, they would literally sometimes confronted the officers, said like, "What are you doing here? Why have you come to fight a war against us? You have nothing to do with our struggle. Why are you doing this?" So the German Americans generally are very critical towards the presence of the German soldiers. Now, many German Americans are not necessarily fervent patriots. They're more probably better described as neutral. But I think no matter what your political persuasion, your soldiers in your neighborhood or in your town is usually not welcome. So I think that even soldiers that were not necessarily ardent patriots or revolutionaries were very critical of the presence of German soldiers fighting for the British in North America. So the relationships, in other words, overall were tense. Now, that being said, we also know that quite a few of the German soldiers, especially the ones that spent extended periods of time as prisoners in places like Reading and Lancaster, ultimately worked for local German families, German American families, and some also married German American women. So on a kind of individual basis, I think they were able to talk to each other. They understood each other in some ways. So on a case by case basis, I think they seem to have gotten along.
Well, it's a fascinating and very textured story, and when I'm leading Revolutionary War tours, one of the messages that I always have for people is that you have this simple image of it's redcoat versus rebel, and it's so much more complicated. You've got the Hessians, you have Native Americans on both sides, you have African Americans fighting on both sides, you have Patriot militia, you have Loyalist militia. So the whole revolution, Spanish, French. We have to go on and have another show talk about that. But the diversity of all that, I think people really have no idea. And as we approach the 250th anniversary of the revolution, I think it's great to be telling these stories. And you have done such a wonderful job telling the story of the Hessians in America. And Friederike Baer's book is Hessions, German Soldiers in the American Revolutionary War. Both Chris Anderson, who has deserted us if you joined late because he had to rake an airplane, really have enjoyed this book and enjoyed talking to you. Thank you so much for writing this, for putting it out there, and for telling this story. And we look forward to whatever stories you're going to tell next.
Thank you so much, Rick. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. So that was amazing to have Friederike on. And I want to mention that next week, we'll be back with another live show, and our guest is Walt Larimore, author of A True World War II, At First Light, a true World War II story of a hero, his bravery, and an amazing horse. So there's a great subtitle that caught our attention. It's a book about Walt's father, so we'll find out what all that is about. And a reminder that you can find archived programs and more at our website, historyhappyhour.com. You can listen to episodes also on the History Happy Hour podcast stream, available wherever you get your podcast. Keep living, keep learning, and stay safe, everybody.